consciousness is the starting point of reality.
Completely antithetical to that attitude in science.
What is reality?
We're now at this great inflection.
Video games and all of that is actually the most important spiritual tools we've got today.
The whole point of a virtual reality is to have useful fiction of causality.
The individual never gets enlightened. It's the enlightenment that becomes the individual.
Space-time is doomed.
Consciousness is fundamental.
Einstein's theory actually predicts its own demise.
Balance is not the ability to stand up, it's the ability to rise up.
Please like, comment, and subscribe.
Donald Hoffman is a neuroscientist who has been exploring consciousness and reality for many years. He caused quite a stir with this book, The Case Against Reality, where he's suggesting that consciousness is the author of reality and that space-time is the consequence of consciousness and not the other way around, which is more the established thinking in today's science. In these conversations, we will be exploring the bridge between modern spirituality and science. What, again, I find interesting about you is that your work is focusing on what people have been trying to figure out for hundreds and thousands of years, basically. You know, what is consciousness? What is reality? And how can we figure this out? To me, the wonderful thing about what's happening in science today is that one is starting to kind of penetrate that area that has been exclusive to spiritual explorers and teachers. And to me, it's so important that we finally, have scientists who can go in and try to figure out what this is for real. Because it's one thing, when you have your experiences, but as one knows from a scientific perspective, that's not science. We need science in order to understand this as humans, as living beings. And spiritual traditions simply are not enough. So I'm really kind of rooting for your work and everybody like you because it's about time and it's needed. So if we just start, how did you get interested in this field?
Well, I was raised in a family that had both science and spirituality. My father had a master's degree in chemistry. My mother had a bachelor's in biology. So they both knew some science. And they eventually both got master's degrees in counseling. So they were no strangers to education and science. And my dad was also a minister. Later on in his life, he, in his midlife, he became an associate pastor and then a pastor of his own small church. And it was I was raised from about age 10 on in a fundamentalist Christian framework that was anti-science, frankly, in its standings. I remember statements like, if God intended us to go to the moon, he would have given us wings, things like that. So I got both, and I saw how both worked, and so I got interested in figuring out for myself, what's going on here, because the two each seem to have a piece of the puzzle, but they also seem to have a really bad side as well. And so I wanted to figure out for myself. So the question that I posed to myself, even as a teenager, was quite clearly, are we just machines? That was how I put it to myself, because on the one hand, in the spiritual setting, there was talk of souls and things that transcended space and time. And on the other hand, I had been introduced to programming and enjoyed programming. My mother actually ended up being a programmer. She, a quite accomplished computer programmer for various banks and so forth. And so I got into programming and was interested in artificial intelligence kinds of things. even as a teenager. So I even as a teen, had sharpened up the question for myself: are we just machines or not? That was how I wanted to, and I wanted to then really understand what we mean by a machine, and what would it mean to say that we're not machines, that there's something more to humans than machines. And when I found, eventually I went to MIT for my graduate work, and there I went to the Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, so I was part of the AI laboratory at MIT, and what's now called the Brain and Cognitive Sciences Department. So you can see, once again, I was doing both the psychology side, the very human side, studying that, but then also studying what it means to be a machine. And I figured in that setting, I would get the most rigorous understanding available at the time of what it means to be a machine, what are the scope and limits of machines, and could I figure out from that the answer to my question? If could I rigorously figure out, are we just machines, or is there something more? So that was sort of how I got into it. One other thing that happened, though, was when I was an undergraduate at UCLA. I took a lot of computer programming classes. I actually worked at Hughes Aircraft Company, worked my way through my upper division at UCLA, at Hughes Aircraft, writing software for Hughes. I wrote in machine code for a microprocessor called the Anyuk 30. It was a military microprocessor, state of the art at the time. It was for doing simulations on F-18, F-14, you know, fighter jets, for their cockpit displays and for various missions they might do. And so I learned how to program in machine code, assembly code, and higher level languages. So I got a real grounding. I mean, day in and day out, having to turn out code and seeing what machines could do. So it was good for me. I mean, it was hard. It was intense to go to UCLA, working 24, 30 hours a week while I was going to school full time. But I got a degree at UCLA in quantitative psychology, which you can see once again what I'm after: the psychology, but with mathematical rigor. So it's been a pretty clear focus, and it was due in large part to the influence of my parents, and the both the science and the religion, and me then trying to make sense of what wasn't mixing very well in my mind.
Right. To me, that what many people are experiencing, spirituality and science being like two different planets. To me, that's simply the result of misunderstandings. And
Yes.
There is, from my perspective, there is only one reality, but there are different approaches to exploring it. But it is the exploration that is important. And to me, what spirituality you really need to learn from science is to develop methodology, to explore, because a lot of the belief systems and models, also from individuals with a high level consciousness, of course, were developed when people didn't know a lot. And it's, they've been attempting at explaining high levels of consciousness, but not having the models, the information. So it just becomes fluffy. And it's in the same thing kind of from the scientific perspective, where often one is trying to only describe what we already relate to. We kind of go to the visualization tools, and science tries to kind of just explain that, while from the spiritual perspective, that's what we're trying to go beyond. And this is what I find so interesting about your work. You're actually trying to figure out how can we go beyond that kind of membrane of our own experience. And to me, that is the new frontier of science, that this is where we need to go. So like, how did you kind of end up with the realization or the understanding that consciousness is the starting point of reality, instead of the more established idea that consciousness is the product of manifestation?
Right. So that took a while. the point that you made is a very important point, I think, that the spiritual traditions have had some very, very deep insights into consciousness and have understood for quite a long time that space-time and matter aren't the final reality, that there's something deeper. And science, I mean, early scientists, many of them had religious faith. I mean, Newton was religious, but there was always tension. I mean, the famous tension between Galileo and the Catholic Church, where he ended up in prison, house arrest, and threatened he had to give up his view that the Earth isn't the center, of the universe. So there's been an approach avoidance between science and spirituality, in particular Christianity, since that was the relevant spirituality in Europe at the time. And what science got right was this precise mathematical approach, where you start, of course, with ideas and that are casual and informal and loosely thought out. They're not precise, and then you say, well, how can I take that idea and really give it the appropriate attention that it deserves by making it precise? In other words, if we think an idea is a good idea, then it actually deserves to be made as precise as we can. And what science has discovered since Galileo, and Galileo, give him credit for sort of putting us on this path, not alone, but he was a big part of it, was recognizing that being precise means using mathematics and logic, but mathematics and logic where you can write things down and compute implications of your ideas. And the idea there is, once you write down a mathematical statement of the idea, then the mathematics, because it has its own internal logic and things can be derived algebraically, for example, you can say, well, if this mathematics is true, then this mathematics is a consequence. And that new mathematics might not be something that you would have ever guessed, right? I mean, even if you're brilliant, you can't see all of the implications of your ideas. And some of the implications may be wonderful and you may like them, and others may make you go, oh, wow, I didn't really intend my idea to go that direction. I think that's wrong, so I need to refine my idea. And so science got that, and that's an incredible gift, frankly, that humanity has, is, and we don't really understand it, why it is that mathematics and logic has such power for making things precise, looking at their implications, and learning, becoming students of the mathematical account of our own ideas. So I think you're right that what scientists were doing, though, is you can't start on the big deep problems. Right? It's too much. You got to start on something simple. Like Galileo said, let me roll a ball down an inclined plane and see how fast it goes, and then change the angle of in other words, instead of going after God and life beyond space and time, let's look at how fast balls roll. And so it's very humble. You might go, who could give a rip about how fast a ball rolls down an inclined plane? But it turned out that by studying little bits of matter and how they move in space and time and being very, very careful, we built up the tools. So we had, in some sense, I mean, you can't climb Mount Everest first. You got to try the local hill, right? And see if you can go up that local hill. You can't run a marathon. Try running a quarter-mile track, and see how you do. And so that's what's sort of been going on since Galileo. Is scientists got this wonderful tool of mathematical precision matched with careful experiments. But we had to start off with sort of trivial stuff, but we've really built the tools up And now I think we're at the position where we can do what you're talking about, which is start to look at the big, deep questions that really matter to us as human beings. We have these tools, they've been surprisingly useful, but there's been now this tradition in the science, in the sciences, to be physicalist and reductionist. So space, time, and matter is all that there is. And we're trying to understand reality by going to smaller and smaller scales of space-time. Because as we go to smaller scales of space-time, we find more and more fundamental laws. So there's been this reductionist view, like particle physics, elementary particle physics, the vacuum physics is the most fundamental science. If we understand that, then we can build up to understand chemistry, and then biology, and then psychology, and then maybe consciousness. But it's been a reductionist view, and the idea that consciousness might be fundamental, which the spiritual traditions have had for thousands of years, is completely antithetical to that attitude in science. So science has had the tools, fantastic tools, but a framework that rejects any idea that consciousness could be fundamental. It has to be emergent from something physical. So that's the reductionist. Whereas the spiritual side has had this wonderful idea that space, time, and matter aren't fundamental, consciousness is, but they haven't had the tools. And we're now at this great inflection in human history where each side has something really precious to offer the other. And if we can bring the two together, the techniques, the mathematics and the experimental techniques, and also the give and take of scientists trying to disprove other scientists' theories, which is absolutely essential, absolutely essential. Individual scientists are dogmatic, but science as a social institution is not. As a social institution, there are no ideas that cannot be attacked. None. You have to have the right tools to attack them. You better attack them intelligently. But if you are up to the task, no ideas are off the table. Even space-time itself can be attacked as a fundamental reality. But you can't just wave your hands and say, I think space-time isn't the truth. That means no scientist will give you 5 seconds of their time. It's got to be, in a serious way. So we have the tools in science, we have the deep ideas in spirituality. And so getting the anti-dogmatic social structure of science together with the deep ideas in spirituality, and then the tools of science, I think is a wonderful win. My own feeling is that the spiritual traditions have many wonderful insights, but not the tools to carry those insights to their conclusions and to evolve them. And scientists have not been interested in what's beyond space-time because they figured there wasn't anything beyond space-time. And now I think we're at a position where the failure of scientists to understand consciousness, now they've been trying for several decades really hard to understand consciousness, and the utter failure to understand even one specific conscious experience has really, I think, started to make scientists wake up to the possibility of something.
But I think that the further you go, like when you explore and try to examine consciousness, figure out what it is, at some point you will have to arrive at the conclusion that consciousness is fundamental, and not a product of, because there is absolutely no evidence of consciousness being the product of manifestation. So I think that's also one has exhausted, in a way, every avenue of trying to figure out consciousness, as the product of manifestation. And basically your conclusion is the only one left.
Right. I should say why the scientists stick with the idea that consciousness is a product of physical stuff. And by the way, The researchers who are doing this are brilliant. Many of them are personal friends of mine, and hats off to them. I'm glad they're doing what they're doing. They're brilliant people. They're wonderful people, and they're well motivated. They're trying to understand consciousness as a product of brain activity, say, or physical systems more generally. And here's the kind of evidence that they would use to say why they think that they're right. If I take a magnet called a transcranial magnetic stimulator, TMS unit, and I touch it to an area up here, just outside your skull, just touch your skull with it, close to what's called area V5, visual area 5 of the cortex in the left hemisphere. You will all of a sudden not be able to see anything moving in the right part of your visual world. You can see motion of objects in the left part of the visual world, but not in the right. You get what's called hemiakinetopsia. You turn the magnet off, and all of a sudden you once again have the conscious experience of things moving smoothly in space. But when I put the magnet on there, it's more like a stroboscope, like at a disco, where you see something there, and then you see it there, but you don't see it moving smoothly. And so it's a natural conclusion from something like that says, look, I intervene on the brain, and when I change the state of the brain, your conscious experience changes. And when I stop intervening, the conscious experience changes back. Yeah. And it's very natural for people to say that's clear empirical evidence that the brain causes consciousness.
But yes, so but in a way, like from a spiritual perspective, this is within the existing explanations, because one separates what we call vertical and horizontal consciousness. The horizontal consciousness is when consciousness is being projected through a form. So basically that form functions both as a filter, but then also becomes an entity of consciousness. And the vertical consciousness is kind of beyond the form. So this is the whole idea around incarnation, that consciousness incarnates and then gets kind of locked into that form, and then is able to experience through that form based on its limitations. Because, in spiritual traditions, one would see all manifestation and incarnation as a result of resistance. So everything in existence is there to protect one from the absolute reality, which one is not able to deal with. So one is able to experience limited versions of reality until the consciousness expands to the level of being able to embrace all there is. So in that process, one separates the idea of the vertical consciousness from the horizontal one.
I like that idea, and let me try to say it in another language and see if you agree, if it's on the same track as what you're saying. So another way perhaps to say that idea, if I understand you, is that space and time, I like to call them, space and time and physical objects are just like a virtual reality. They're not the final reality, they're a visualization tool. And so if consciousness is fundamental and consciousness is complex, I might have a visualization tool that dumbs things down a little bit, that makes it more accessible to me. And so I am interacting with other consciousnesses. I think that's what you call the vertical consciousness, but I only see it through an interface, through a visualization tool, which would be what I think you were talking about, as the horizontal side of things. And if you then think about how we actually use these, like a virtual reality visualization tool, like if we're playing a game, like, an auto racing game of some kind, right? And you see a virtual steering wheel and you see virtual cars, and you know that if you turn the steering wheel, the car will seem to go to the left if you turn counterclockwise, and right if you turn clockwise, and so forth. It feels to you like the steering wheel has causal powers. I turn to the left, it has that intervention in the virtual realm feels like it's actually doing something real because my car seems to be moving in a different way. Similarly, then the brain would be like that steering wheel. It's not the fundamental reality, it's a virtual reality. And so the whole point of a virtual reality is to have a useful fiction of causality. It's not genuine causality, it's a useful fiction of causality. I mean, in the virtual reality game, in that metaphor, what you're really interacting with is some supercomputer with all of its diodes and resistors, voltages and magnetic fields. But you don't see that. You're just turning a steering wheel. But by turning the steering wheel, you think the steering wheel is doing all the work. But in fact, that's really what's really going on is millions of voltage changes are happening in the computer. And that's what's really doing the work. And so when my colleagues take the kind of example I just gave of taking a magnet, touching it to your skull and having your consciousness change, and they think, okay, that means that the brain caused the consciousness to change. That's the same mistake as saying the virtual reality steering wheel really has causal powers and really is doing the work. It's the same. It's by the way, it's not a trivial mistake, right? It's a very natural mistake because, especially if you are a physicalist, you think that the steering wheel is the final reality. There's nothing else to have causal powers. But is that sort of along the lines of what you're saying with vertical and horizontal?
Kind of. Also because, in spiritual philosophy, one would say that it's not possible to separate the observation from the individual observing it, because it's the same thing. So when we actually say that it's the observer that is the author of reality. So nothing is really being observed, it's being projected. So that the observation in itself is false because it is the product of the horizontal consciousness in action. So basically, everything we experience is the result of the projection of what one will refer to as resistance or karma, which basically is a filtering process where you reject everything in oneness or complete reality. And this is what you're left with. And what comes into reality is then the mathematical conclusion, in a way, of your own resistance. And that means that, the idea is that we exist in a kind of blank nothingness. That is also the allness. And based on that, based on our consciousness, based on our own level of evolution in consciousness, our degree of resistance will be what causes the illusion of manifestation. And one then also says that nothing that is manifested actually exists outside the observation of it. So the idea that something exists by itself, like when you close your eyes and when you go out of the room, like we make the assumption, of course, that manifestations are still there. But based on spiritual ideas, it's like, no, it can only exist for as long as someone is observing it. And then the natural conclusion would be that there are higher levels of consciousness and mind, collective minds, that are kind of projecting and thinking together, that is part of keeping manifestations alive, so to speak. But it's still part of then collective projections, which is what one in spiritual traditions will look upon as the different universes or multiverses or levels of existence, which then is horizontal and is simply representing the different levels of consciousness and how it filters the oneness into collective experience.
Right. That makes sense. But let me say it in another way to see if I've understood it. So going back to the VR kind of analogy, I mean, absolutely everything that you see with the VR headset on is your creation, right? If I see a red Ferrari that I'm racing, I look over there, I see the red Ferrari. That's because I'm, in some sense, creating the red Ferrari. Now, if I turn my headset over there, I see a green Mustang. I have deleted, I've quit making the red Ferrari. I don't make that anymore. It's gone. Now I'm making a green Mustang. And so as I move my headset around, I'm rendering and creating different things, but they only exist in my perceptions. And so, so the nice thing is that that young people today who are spending a lot of time in multiplayer video games and virtual reality kinds of settings, this kind of idea is easily grasped for them. I mean, the idea that, and as VR gets more and more compelling,
Exactly.
I think it won't be very hard for a 15-year-old kid to spend several days in highly compelling virtual reality settings to take off the headset and just naturally wonder, well, what about this?
Exactly.
Could this be a VR as well? So VR may actually end up helping people to sort of break out of this.
I've been talking about this for years and years now, that video games and all of that is actually the most important spiritual tools we've got today, because it assists the mind in being less invested in one template of reality and asking those questions, what's beyond this? Is this all made up? And younger people, yes, they are more open to the idea that there are many different ways of constructing reality. And so I think the whole thing with virtual reality and video games are so important. And it has opened the collective mind as well. Because I think to be able to go beyond, the collective template of reality, we need first to imagine that it's possible. And it's definitely kind of loosened everything up.
Right. And that, what you said, comes to another thing that you said earlier, which is that there's some kind of cooperation between different consciousnesses in the way that, as you said, they were manifesting. But you could put that in this other language of saying that in some sense, when we have these multiplayer VR games, they're cooperating. I mean, I might be playing with somebody who, I'm in California right now. Maybe I'm playing with someone who is in Europe and someone else who's in China, and we're all racing together, and we're all coordinating. We're all creating. So there's a deeper reality, the supercomputer that's in this metaphor is coordinating things, but we're all cooperating because we're all, with our headsets, sort of fabricating the same virtual reality. And so we can all talk about the red Ferrari, even though there's only the red Ferrari I make, the one that you make, and my friend in China makes, and so forth. And there's no such thing as the red Ferrari. And nevertheless, we can have the useful fiction of an objective red Ferrari that's out there that we're all talking about. And maybe I'm trying to beat that red Ferrari, even though my friend is racing it. So there is that kind of cooperation. And I think that ultimately in the science of consciousness will be is an interesting mathematical issue, which is how do different consciousnesses cooperate? What kind of dynamics allows them to cooperate in a way that they create new coherent virtual realities, right? So humans, for example, we seem to have a roughly similar shared virtual reality, but it's very different from the reality that, say, a mouse might have or an ant.
Yes.
So they're
actually
different
all of that. This is part of what I'm teaching people, including scientists. I could explain all this to you if we had several days, because it's very complex, but once you get it, it's actually quite simple. So if I could just try to explain a little bit of the model one is using in the deeper spiritual traditions, it's basically that if you take as a premise that there is one absolute reality, that is that state of oneness. That is, the closest you can get to that is the absolute mathematics of isness. So it's beyond any form of existence. And often that's referred to as the sea, the ocean of nothingness, or allness. And the thing is, then we have to look at what dimensionality is and how it occurs. And basically back to the idea of resistance. If you can think of consciousness also being like a particle, and the heavier the resistance, the slower it kind of vibrates. And any form of resistance, which is basically just another word for karma, and karma is extremely complex. It can consist of billions of different variations and vibrations, but each of those vibrations will also be translated into mathematical coordinates. And those coordinates is actually what gives the appearance of dimensionality, just like the virtual reality game. So when you vibrate to the same level of resistance, the illusion of space appears because you will be in that same kind of, type of experience, that same level of consciousness. And because when you have several individuals vibrating in the kind of the same area, that will make a certain dimension seem real. But it's simply the collective experience of one's own consciousness. And so one appears to be in the same space, while in reality, there is no such thing as a space. And so one will end up with this infinite universe, infinite multiverse of opportunities and possibilities. And it's simply based on all the different types of vibration that you as consciousness is kind of vibrating at any given moment. And like when you, for instance, look at the example of a mouse and a human being, to a mouse or to an insect or a flower, you are an interdimensional being because you have access to levels of reality that, for instance, a flower does not. So you, to that flower, that exists in a more limited dimension of experience, you are an interdimensional being. And that flower can experience you based on the awareness of that flower, but is not able to go beyond that and will experience whatever that is you that kind of fits within that kind of octave. And the rest of you is in another dimension for that flower. So in spirituality, one sees dimension as extremely complex. It's not a place. It's the experience of kind of co-vibrational reality.
So there could be various shared realities for different systems of consciousnesses.
Exactly. Yes, and whenever there is a kind of shared vibration, that will immediately become a dimension. Because it's just basically also when we meet someone and we kind of click with them, we can experience that as a kind of bubble. We can experience that connection, and all of a sudden we feel kind of transported out of the kind of collective space around us. And we, in fact, become a separate dimension. And often when that happens, our sense of time and space also changes. And it's because that change in dimension, although it's slight, is actually real. So from a spiritual perspective, one sees dimension as part of the expression of consciousness and the level of resistance and the complexity of resistance. And this is what one is trying also to figure out in spiritual traditions, and the deep spiritual work is, how can we go beyond this? How can we neutralize our resistance so that we're able to experience more of that expanded awareness?